Please join me in welcoming Amelia White.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you everyone for coming tonight, especially those of y'all that came last month and came back for more. I really appreciate that. Didn't scare anyone away. I'm gonna go ahead and hit start on my timer. That's why I have my phone up here. Otherwise, I will talk for hours and nobody wants to be here that long. So please don't think I'm rude that I have my phone here. Welcome to our second month of Texas History 101. We're gonna pick up where we left off last month, but don't worry, I'll give a quick recap, and then we're gonna go through the end of 1835. So we had this big political mess happening down in Mexico that set off the larger Mexican Federalist War. There was fighting in Zacatecas, this city over here that was particularly bad. In the fall of 1835, Santa Anna allows his troops 2 days after the battle with which to ransack the city. And that serves as an example for the Texans and other people in Mexico as to what will happen to you if you rebel against Santa Anna. Now, as part of all of this, he also sends this gentleman here, Martin Perfecto de Cos, who, despite what some of y'all may have heard, was not Santa Anna's brother-in-law. That is one of those things that a historian decided that once upon a time, and everybody has repeated it afterwards. But what historians have since learned, and again, this is, some people agree, some people don't agree. It's like that with everything in history. You'll get people in multiple camps. But there's now a historian who's gone back and said that they don't think that Cos was actually related to Santa Anna through marriage. That it's one of those things where his bride had a common last name, but there's no actual proof that woman was linked to Santa Anna's family. But that's one of those things that you will, every accounting of the Texas Revolution, you will hear that Cos was Santa Anna's brother-in-law, and that's why he was gonna come to Texas to make an example of the Texans, but that's not the case. But at any rate, Cos is a general in the Mexican army, and he is sent to Texas because there's all this political agitation going on up here. So he's sent with about 500 men, and they're supposed to reinforce the various garrisons in South and Central Texas. So he lands at Copano on September 20th and marches his men to Goliad, arriving there on October 2nd. Meanwhile, this gentleman, Domingo Ugartechea, is in command of the military assets in Texas prior to the arrival of Cos, and he has decided that it might be a good idea to start disarming some of these colonists. And so he's going to actually send orders to both Victoria and Gonzales that cannons that have been loaned to the citizens of those towns be turned back over to the Mexican government. On September 27th, Lieutenant Francisco de Castaneda, with a small command of about 100 troops, is going to leave San Antonio de Bejar, headed to Gonzales to retrieve the cannon. So this map will show you kind of where Gonzales is. It's located right here in the middle of Green DeWitt's colony. It was a relatively new civilian settlement. There were no troops there. There was no presidio. There was no mission. This was a new settlement that had been built by Anglo colonists in the colony of impresario Green DeWitt, who, along with Martin de Leon, who was in an adjacent colony, as well as Stephen F. Austin, were considered to be the three most successful impresarios of the whole colonization period. So the city is about 80 miles east of San Antonio. And that is where Castaneda is headed. This is not the cannon, although, again, this is one of those things that's disputed. Some people think it is the cannon. Some people think it was another cannon. But this is in the museum there in Gonzales, and they represent it as the cannon. And the town had been given the cannon in 1831. And the reason was that they were constantly being attacked by different native groups, the Comanche, the Tonkawa, and the Karankawa specifically. And so they had written to San Antonio appealing for military support against the natives. And basically they get the response that they can't spare troops, but they can spare a cannon for the defense of the town. Now, in 1835, when it comes to be called back to the military, it's not actually even working. So to give you an idea, this is all over a cannon that doesn't even work. It wouldn't fire a cannonball, not that they had cannonballs anyway, but they could set off the powder and it would cause a loud boom, and that would sort of scare away the different native groups. And so they were using it that way. And then here's a look at, this is the town of Gonzales here, the little plat map. You'll see they're right along the river. This is the Guadalupe River, and then we also have, what was the other river? San Marcos River. Lieutenant Castaneda and his troops are going to arrive outside Gonzales on September 29th, and when they get there, they find that the Texan colonists have removed the ferry boat from the Guadalupe River. So the Mexican army can't cross the river into the town. So at this point, they are met by a group that's referred to as the Old 18, because there were 18 of them. And these are sort of the colonists that are on hand in Gonzales when the Mexican army shows up. And so at this point, the Old 18 and Castaneda are yelling back and forth across the river to one another because the ferry boat's gone and Castaneda can't cross. And so Castaneda tells the colonists that he has a message for the alcalde, which is sort of like the mayor. It's a municipal government figure whose name is Andrew Ponton. And here we see Andrew Ponton right here on the left, your left. And then this is Albert Martin on the right, who's leading the Old 18. To stall for time, Albert Martin tells Castaneda that Ponton is, and he's just going to have to wait. And so Castaneda, left with no choice, is going to set up camp there on the banks of the river. The Texans, meanwhile, are going to bury the cannon. They bury it in a peach orchard and send word to the nearby settlements that help is needed, that the Mexican army is there and they need reinforcement. Stephen F. Austin will write back to them from San Felipe, cautioning against going on the offensive and counseling restraint. The citizens of Gonzales and the 140 or so Texans that will answer their call for aid will not be restrained. So during all of this, the colonists do dig back up the cannon. They decide that they're going to actually fix it, and they do manage to fix it. But as I said earlier, they don't have any cannonballs. So they start rounding up scrap metal, including metal chains, and that's what they're firing from the cannon, or going to fire from the cannon. Leading the artillery command is a North Carolinian who came to Texas by way of Alabama named James C. Neal. And we'll talk about him a number of times today and next month. Also with him is a gentleman by the name of Almiron Dickinson. Both of them had been in artillery field commands in the War of 1812, so they had experience operating cannons, so they are put in charge of the small 6-pound cannon. 6 pound, by the way, refers to the weight of the cannonball that the cannon would fire. So again, even if it's a little bit bigger than this one here, it's still a very, very small cannon. And they did have with them another cannon, which is what people think this one actually is, which was a smaller 2-pound cannon. And this was found after a flood in the area in 1936. So anyway, back to the fight. We call it the Battle of Gonzales today, but they called it the fight at Williams's place because that's where it took place, was on Williams's farm. And on the night of October 1st, the Texans are going to decide that they are going to attack the Mexican army. And I'm gonna be honest, this is not the most auspicious beginning to a war. It's kind of a little comical, if you will. They cross over the river in the middle of the night, but it's foggy and no one can really see where they're going. The Texans' position is given away when a dog crosses the path of a horse and the rider is thrown to the ground, causing enough noise that they give away their position to the Mexican army. So in that foggy pre-dawn hours, the two sides start shooting at each other, but they're not, of course, very effective. So they both retreat and hold off until daybreak when the fighting resumes. Now, Castaneda is going to send a flag to parley, and which the Texans agreed to. And when they parley, he asks, why are the Texans shooting at him? And the Texans, they are Federalist sympathizers who are fighting against the centralist Santa Anna, and they are fighting to uphold the Constitution of 1824. Castaneda responds that he too is a Federalist. He is on their side, but he is a soldier and he is under orders to get the cannon, and so he has to. And so the Texans actually offer him the chance to switch sides and join their rebellion, which he does politely decline. So in what is probably one of the most dramatic scenes of the revolution, following the parley, we get the colonists raising a homemade flag with the cannon depicted on it, as well as the phrase, "Come and take it." And if you believe the legends, which I choose to do, they actually made the flag out of pieces from a woman's wedding dress. So that was the white material, was the wedding dress. The flag, unfortunately, was lost sometime in 1835, so it's not an artifact that we have today, unfortunately. So they're going to raise the flag. Ultimately, they're going to fire a single cannon shot from the 6-pound cannon, which again is that scrap metal and chain going around. Castaneda, who is under orders not to escalate violence, is going to decide it's time to retreat. And so all in all, 2 Mexican soldiers are killed, and 1 Texian, the one that fell off his horse when the dog ran in front of his horse, is the only injury on the Texan side. So although the Battle of Gonzales is somewhat anticlimactic, what it has done is turned the potential for rebellion in Texas into an actual armed conflict. They're no longer just talking about fighting against Santa Anna. They've now actually taken up arms and done so. So the colonists are going to continue to gather in Gonzales. Stephen F. Austin comes from San Felipe, and he's elected commander-in-chief of the new Army of the People, which is an all-volunteer group at this point. Some of the colonists want to ride to Goliad and capture General Cos, but before they can act, Cos is on the move to Béjar, and so this Army of the People will follow. On October 27, 1835, Stephen F. Austin sends Jim Bowie and James Fannin and a small contingent of men ahead of the main army to sort of scout out a location for the army to camp. And they find what they think is the perfect place on the grounds of Mission Concepcion, which is pictured there. And as they begin to move into place there, General Cos gets word that the Texians are in the area, and so he actually sends a force out to intercept them. There's a short battle in which the superior weaponry, they're using rifles as opposed to the muskets that the Mexican army are using, so the Texans have the superior rifles. They also, thanks to Jim Bowie, have great field tactics, and they're able to overtake the Mexican army, and Stephen F. Austin and the bulk of the Texas army will make their way to Mission Concepcion outside of San Antonio as well. And the siege of Béjar is on. So meanwhile in Goliad, like I said, Cos had arrived with his men there on October 2nd, where he will receive word at Gonzales and departs for San Antonio on October 5th. Lack of wagons and ox carts, however, mean that most of the supplies that he has brought with him from Mexico are left behind at Presidio La Bahia in Goliad. He's not unable to transport them with the troops. Now, like I said earlier, people had been talking about kidnapping Cos. They had this plan. They would intercept him as he comes from the coast on his way to Béjar. They would kidnap him and basically hold him ransom and negotiate with the government that way. And so down in Matagorda, sightings of Coates's ship results in volunteers there organizing under the leadership of George Collingworth, who's pictured there on the left, and marching towards Gonzales. They stop in Victoria the next day, where they are joined by a company of 30 Tejanos organized under the leadership of Placido Benavides. Benavides was the son-in-law of Martin de Leon, who was an impresario who had formed a colony of primarily Mexican colonists who had come from northern areas along the Rio Grande and some of the other northern areas of what today we would call Mexico. And they had come, and lots of different families, very connected group of people comes and starts the colony there. Placido Benavides comes originally as a school teacher and then marries one of De Leon's daughters, so is connected that way. And he is an ardent Federalist. And he's joined by Texian colonist John Joseph Lynn, who's pictured there on the left. That's sort of a representation. That's not actually Placido Benavides on the right. But we'll talk about him later too and why he's on horseback in this picture. But so this group joins with the group from Matagorda and other groups that are kind of streaming in from. All told, there's about 125 men that are going to gather outside of Gonzales. On October 9th, 49 of them are going to sign what's called the Compact of Volunteers under Collingsworth, pledging loyal to the Mexican federal government. So again, at this point in the fight, it's all about protecting that Constitution of 1824 and the Federalist Republic system. So that night, though, they get word from the townspeople of Goliad that there are only 50 soldiers that have been left at the Presidio there following Coates's departure. And so they decide to go on ahead and make their move. As they march towards Goliad, the main body of the Texan force gets disoriented and lost in the darkness. And as they're standing there trying to decide what to do, all of a sudden from out of the bushes emerges a man. And it's Benjamin Milam. Benjamin Milam is an old Texas colonist. He had come to Texas in 1819 as part of the Long Expedition. And despite being captured and imprisoned as part of that filibustering expedition, he's eventually pardoned and is granted land in Texas. And so he becomes a colonist in Texas in the 1820s. He had been down in Monclova, when the Federalist forces there arrested him and the governor of Texas. And so he had been imprisoned in Monterey before making his escape and coming back to Texas. And as he's escaping and making his way back to Texas, he comes across the men that are about ready to attack Goliad. And so he actually helps them find their way in the dark, and they go on to the town and to the Presidio. In the town, the militia is aided by the townspeople, the local Tejanos, who arm them with axes that they use to start attacking the wooden doors to the Presidio. It's a very short battle. It's only 30 minutes. Again, there were only 50 or so of the Mexican soldiers who had been left behind in an overwhelming Texan force attacking them. And a lot of the Mexican army is actually going to escape, making their way to San Patricio, Refugio, Lipan-Titelon, some of the other places in the area that the Mexican had troops. Most of the men gathered in Goliad on the Texan side, including Placido Benavides and his Tejano volunteers, are going to move on to Béjar to join Stephen F. Austin and his Army of the People. Philip Demet is left behind in command of Presidio La Bahia, which proves out to be a terrible choice because he is going to very quickly alienate most of the local population by doing things like impressing their food and their horses and their mules and putting them into service for the Mexican army, or for the Texas Army rather. And so you'll see some local resistance starting to grow around that area over the months. Right at this point, everyone's all together, but as the months go on, it's gonna get increasingly tense in that area. But before then, in early November, a few weeks later, the Texans moved down the road to the customs house and garrison at Lipan-Titelon, which is right here. So we have Gonzales up here, Goliad, and then Lipan Titalon is down here, sort of close to, or not close to Laredo, but on the way towards the Rio Grande. And so this is where all the troops that were remaining in South Texas, those men that had escaped from Goliad, they're all gathering at the fort at Lipan Titalon. And that is where there will be a 2-day battle. The Mexican army is going to retreat south across the Rio Grande, leaving the only Mexican troops left in Texas at this point as those in San Antonio de Bejar. And those troops have now had their supply lines to the coast and to the Rio Grande cut by the Texian and Tejano volunteers. So back in Bejar, we have the siege of Bejar, which has lasted from October 12th to December 11th. During this time, troop numbers for the Texans are going to fluctuate as people are sort of coming and going. But the army of approximately 600 men is going to be assembled during this time, including both Tejanos and Anglo colonists. Commanding officer Stephen F. Austin is a little hesitant to attack the fortified town, even though by the day the Texan numbers are growing and they are actually superior to those that Cos has under his command inside the town. San Antonio is such a fortified position at this point that the Texans are afraid that they'll lose too many people in trying to attack it. So they're kind of holding off, waiting for the perfect moment. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the people who are in the camp. There's a group of men called the New Orleans Grays who are going to arrive in Texas. Now, these are volunteers from the United States. They're called the New Orleans Grays because they were a company that was organized in the city of New Orleans, which has a long history, long relationship with San Antonio. And they were organized at the famous Banks Arcade. And so there was a group of men who volunteered. If you would join the Texan cause, they would offer you land in Texas. Of course, the Texans don't have any money. They can't pay you for joining the army. But if you would sign up for 6 months of service, you would get 320 acres worth of land in Texas. And so they're called the New Orleans Grays, partially, of course, because they come from New Orleans. And there was a surplus of gray fabric in one of the local stores there in New Orleans. So that merchant donates the fabric and they're made the gray uniform. So they're the New Orleans Grays. And they're sort of the few troops on the Texan side that you'll actually see in matching uniforms, because most of the Texians were volunteers, and so therefore weren't outfitted like a professional army would have been. Also in the camp is one of my favorite historic characters. This is a gentleman named Deaf Smith. Deaf Smith, again, like Milam, was a longtime colonist. He'd come in the 1820s, not as part of the long expedition, but early on. And he had actually married a Tejana woman in the San Antonio area. So he was married into a local family. And he, like many of the Tejanos and many of the longer residents of Texas, originally tried to stay out of the fight. He was perfectly content being a Mexican citizen, up to the centralist brouhaha, but he was perfectly happy living in Mexico and didn't really want to get involved into a fight that wasn't his. And so he remains neutral initially, but as the siege goes on, he's actually unable to go home. One day, the Mexican sentries block his path as he's trying to return into San Antonio because he's an Anglo, and they tell him he can't go in the city. And in fact, they insult him so badly, they knock his hat off his head as they go to, sort of hit him on the top of the head, and they knock his hat off. And he is so insulted by this that he promptly joins the Texan cause. And luckily for us, he did, because he is going to be an incredible scout throughout the entire war. He's a close confidant of Sam Houston as the war goes on, and we'll talk about him next month in his role in the Battle of San Jacinto, because he plays a very pivotal role there. But yeah, so he's one of the men that's inside the camp. During the siege, we have a brief skirmish that's known as the Grass Fight, which takes place on November 26th. Rumors start spreading through the Texas camp that the pay the gold that's going to be used to pay the Mexican soldiers is on its way to San Antonio. Why they would be sending gold in the middle of a siege, I have no idea. But that's the rumor that's making its way through the Texans camp. And so when they see a line of mules and horses being led from the Alamo out into the sort of, well, I don't know what you would call it, but out of San Antonio into the area, the Texans decide to attack. They are sorely disappointed when they do that, finding rather than saddlebags filled with gold, they find that the animals are loaded with horse to feed the rest of the animals that are inside of San Antonio. So that is the infamous grass fight. So instead of getting gold, they get grass. And so finally, the siege is going to be laid to rest in early December. Stephen F. Austin has received orders from the Provisional Government of Texas that's meeting in Washington on the Brazos that he is to go to the United States as an ambassador. He and Benjamin Archer and William Wharton have been selected to go and sort of go on a publicity tour of the United States to raise money and men for the cause. And so he will leave. And that leaves Edward Burleson in charge of the Texian troops. Now, Burleson, like Stephen F. Austin, was very hesitant to attack. Again, he sort of kind of didn't want to blow the one chance that they had. The men in the camp, however, are beyond ready to fight. They've been sitting there for over a month at this point, and they're ready for some action. As Burleson is trying to decide whether or not to retire to winter quarters, Ben Milam again, implores him to let him lead an attack on the town. And so Burleson finally agrees and says that Milam can lead an attack on the town, but only if the men agree to fight. He's not going to force anyone to fight. So Ben Milam goes back to the Texian camp, and this image here is showing this moment where he gets up and he waves his hat and he says, "Who will follow old Ben Milam to San Antonio?" And the answer is pretty much everyone. So they are going to make plans to attack, which will happen on the morning of December 5th. Here you can see sort of a map of San Antonio. Here's the main part of the town over here. The Alamo, which of course is in the middle of downtown San Antonio today, was across the river and a couple miles away from the rest of the town. And so on the morning of December 5th, you have James C. Neal and his artillery crew are going to fire on the Alamo to create a diversion as an attack is led on the town itself. And there's going to be 4 days of house-to-house fighting as the Texans slowly take control of the town using the Veramendi Palace, which was the family home of Jim Bowie's in-laws, the Veramendis, who had been killed in the 1830s in a cholera epidemic that swept through the city, leaving Jim Bowie as the owner of the house at that point. But so they're using that house as well as the house of Navarro, Jose Antonio Navarro, a well-known Tejano who's very influential later on during the Declaration of Independence and all of that we'll talk about next time. But again, Tejano elites, they're using their house in San Antonio as well. And it really is house-to-house fighting, block by block. They're making their way through the town. There's tremendous amount of property loss to the Tejanos that live there, as well as some civilian casualties. There's at least one Tejano woman who's actually bringing water to some of the cannon crews and is actually killed in the crossfire. Finally, on the morning of December 9th, Cos is going to surrender. Oh, sorry, I totally forgot. Before we get to the surrender, December 7th, unfortunately, Benjamin Milam is leaving the Veramendi Palace and he is shot in the forehead by a sniper who's sitting in a tree outside the palace. Shoots and kills Benjamin Milam, unfortunately, leaving Edward Burleson back in charge. So on December 9th, when we have the surrender, when Cos finally signals for a surrender, Burleson will be the one that he is negotiating with. Now, Burleson grants very generous surrender terms to Cos and his men. He allows them to keep their arms, including some of their cannon. And you might be wondering why. And that's because he allows them to leave Texas. He orders them to march from San Antonio below the Rio Grande. On the march between San Antonio and the Rio Grande, and even on the way down to Mexico City, you have Comanche, you have Apache, you have other hostile native groups. So to send a group of men off without weapons would have been, suicide essentially. And so Burleson allows them to keep their weapons as they depart town. So what is Mexico's reaction to all of this? Of course, they don't get word quite yet that the battle has already fallen, that San Antonio has already fallen, but they know that the attack has happened. We get this gentleman here whose name is Jose Maria Tornel, who is Secretary of War. And on December 30th, he's going to issue a decree that's really going to set up what happens in the later part of the war, and it's known as the Tornel Decree. So in this decree, he states that all foreigners who take up arms against Mexico shall be deemed a pirate and dealt with accordingly. In other words, they will be executed. To them, foreigners coming in and taking up arms against Mexico, not under the Texas flag. So it's not the United States attacking Mexico. It's individuals from the United States coming and attacking Mexico. And so they deemed them pirates or freebooters, which is another word for filibusters. So this is something that they've been dealing with since the Mexican Wars of Independence, people coming in and trying to steal parts of Texas. And so they kind of lay the law down at this point and say, if you come in and take up arms against us, we are going to treat you as pirates, not as soldiers. And so we'll see the effects of that later in 1835 at Goliad in particular, which we'll talk about next month. Now, Cos and his men are on their way marching south. Meanwhile, marching north, starting to leave out of Mexico City, is President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. So even though he's president of the country, he's sort of temporarily put his vice president in charge again. That's something he likes to do. He gets into power and then puts his vice president in charge. So he puts his vice president in charge and decides to personally lead up the army. He is going to be bringing about 2,000 men with him. He ultimately, just before they get to the border, is going to break them in two. Half of the men under the command of General Urrea are going to head towards Goliad, and the other half, under the command of Santa Anna himself, are going to head to San Antonio. And that is the cliffhanger that I will leave us on for today. So that has brought us to December of 1835. So are there any questions about anything today? Yeah, let's get you the microphone.
You mentioned there was two cannons that they were going to come to get. One was, I think you said Victoria, maybe?
Yeah. So Ugartechea, he sends out the command is sort of generally any cannon that's been lent to the townspeople needs to come back. And so there's a cannon in Gonzales and there's a cannon in Victoria. And Placido Benavides, who I mentioned earlier, he is the alcalde, the mayor of Victoria. And so there's a group of Mexican soldiers that will go to Victoria to get the cannon there. And they also have a standoff there where they basically refuse to hand over the cannon. But it doesn't get to the point of shots getting fired. So that's why Gonzales is still that starting point. But yeah, there had been a similar standoff in Victoria. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? No such thing. Oh, no, that's a great question. So Deef was his nickname. He was hard of hearing. He wasn't born, if I'm remembering this correctly, he wasn't born hard of hearing, but it sort of developed over his lifetime. And we'll see a picture next month, and it's that sort of very famous painting of the surrender of Santa Anna, where you have Houston laying down and under the tree because he's hurt his, And Deef Smith is sitting right next to him going like this. His first name was Erasmus. with a U. But yeah, so Deef was a nickname. Absolutely. Yeah, good question. Anyone else? All right. Well, Meg has a couple announcements, but I just want to say thank you for coming tonight. I appreciate y'all.
Okay, my mom would be upset if I didn't tell you. I'm supposedly related to Ben Milam, so just keep that with you. It must be through one of the siblings, though, since he died so young. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that we have a lot of great programs coming up. There's a calendar that all of you, I'm sure, have seen, but I'd encourage you to pick one up if you haven't in the back. And we also, this Saturday, have our art auction in downtown Houston. There are still a few tickets available, but you can also bid online, which is kind of fun, and watch the bidding and see how much pieces go for. You can do that through our website. It's called Art Untamed. And lastly, not this Sunday, but next Sunday, we have our big free Halloween event. And that's a project that Suzanne and I work on a lot. We get candy donations, but that serves a true cross-section of the Galveston community. And so it's really neat to see families, many come for the first time to a museum with their kids. And so then later, when we have field trips, we hear from them that that's when they first came to a museum. So it's pretty special. Anyway, thank you all so much for your support. We look forward to seeing you at the third installment of Texas History 101.